Troy has fallen. After 10 years of brutal siege, the Greek armies have won, and the city has burned to the ground. Every soldier is now making his way home. But one of them, Odysseus, king of Ithaca, cannot find his way back. The sea will not carry him where he wants to go. One of the gods has turned against him. And the road home runs through one-eyed giants, sorceresses who turn men into animals, and monsters whose songs promise death. Back home, an entirely different war is underway. His wife holds off dozens of suitors who have taken over her household, weaving by day and secretly undoing her work by night, while his son grows up barely knowing his father's face. This story is perhaps the oldest journey ever told in human literature, the Odyssey. So why does it take one hero so unbearably long to get home? And why does that long journey still hold audiences captive thousands of years later? Here is the story. The name attached to this epic has stayed the same for nearly 3,000 years: Homer. But here is the fascinating part. Whether Homer actually existed, whether he was a single person or a name later attached to a tradition built by many voices over generations, remains genuinely debated among scholars today. What we do know is that the Odyssey took shape in the Greek language sometime around the 8th or 7th century before Christ. Long before it was ever set down in writing, it almost certainly lived for generations in the mouths of performers. In ancient Greece, traveling bards did not memorize these enormous poems word for word. They improvised in front of audiences at courts and festivals, using formulaic phrases and repeated lines to rebuild the story fresh each time. Research conducted in the 20th century showed that illiterate singers were capable of constructing thousands of lines of verse on the spot using exactly this technique. The Odyssey most likely grew the same way, reshaped again and again across generations, enriched by countless different performers, before finally becoming a fixed written text once literacy spread widely enough to support one. The text we read today runs to 24 books, composed in a Greek verse form called dactylic hexameter, the meter reserved for epic poetry of that era. So behind this book, there is no single writer's desk. There is a tradition stretched across generations, with countless voices layered into the poem we now read. In ancient Greek society, these two epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, were never treated as ordinary literature. Children learned to read using these very lines. Orators quoted them in speeches, and Greek identity itself was shaped, in large part, around these two poems. So, what actually happens in the story? The poem opens in the middle of the action, a technique later writers would call beginning in medias res. The gods first gather on Olympus and decide that Odysseus has suffered enough, that only Poseidon's anger has kept him from home all these years. Troy has fallen, the war is over, but Odysseus cannot find his way back to Ithaca. The god Poseidon has turned against him, because along the way, Odysseus blinded his son, the one-eyed giant Polyphemus, cleverly introducing himself with a false name meaning nobody, which renders the giant's cries for help meaningless to anyone listening. For this, the sea god delays his return for years. What follows reads like a catalog of wonders. Odysseus meets a people who eat the lotus flower and forget everything they once knew, and some of his own men lose all desire to return home after tasting it. He lands on the island of the sorceress Circe, who turns his men into pigs, and he is only protected from her magic by a plant given to him by the god Hermes. He sails past the sirens, whose songs lure sailors to their deaths on the rocks, plugging his crew's ears with wax, while having himself lashed to the ship's mast, just so he alone can hear the song and survive. He steers his ship through a narrow strait between the monsters Scylla and the whirlpool Charybdis, losing several of his men in the process. For years, he is held on the island of the nymph Calypso, consumed by longing for home, yet unable to leave. Through all of it, the goddess Athena never abandons him, offering counsel, appearing in disguise to guide him, working to persuade Zeus, king of the gods, on his behalf. Meanwhile, back in Ithaca, a very different struggle is underway. Odysseus's wife, Penelope, believed by many to be a widow, is besieged by dozens of suitors who have taken over her household and are steadily consuming its wealth. She delays her decision for years by weaving a burial shroud by day, claiming it is for her father-in-law, and secretly unraveling it every night. Their son, Telemachus, now grown, sets out on his own journey to learn what became of his father, visiting old war companions Nestor and Menelaus along the way. Years later, Odysseus returns to his own island in disguise, dressed as an old beggar. His faithful dog, Argos, now aged and neglected, is the only living creature who recognizes him, and dies just moments after seeing his master one last time. Odysseus makes his way into his own hall, silently watches the suitors, secretly reunites with his son, and finally proves his identity through a legendary test, stringing a bow that no other man in the hall can even bend. What follows is the reclaiming of his household, and one of the most moving reunions in literature, his return to Penelope. This is not simply a string of adventures. It is a long meditation on loyalty, patience, and what it truly means to come home. Why does the Odyssey still get read thousands of years later? Perhaps because it speaks so vividly to one of humanity's oldest and most universal fears, the fear of being kept away from home. Everyone, at some point in life, wants to return to somewhere familiar, to people who know them, and this poem tells that longing on an epic scale, set against a backdrop of monsters and gods. Odysseus survives not through brute strength, but through intelligence, cunning, and patience, which sets him apart from most other epic heroes. Penelope shows the same kind of intelligence on her own front, proving that a woman with no physical power can still buy herself time through sheer cleverness. In other words, the poem defines heroism through the mind as much as through the sword. The English word Odyssey comes directly from this book, and today it describes any long, eventful, and difficult journey. The poem has inspired countless later works, from James Joyce's novel Ulysses to films that quietly borrow its structure without ever naming it. In a 2018 BBC Culture poll, this epic was voted the most enduring narrative in the history of literature. Some of its characters have even slipped into everyday English. The word siren and the word mentor both come directly from characters in this story, mentor being the name of the trusted friend who guided Odysseus' son in his father's absence. The book in front of you rests on a translation from ancient Greek, since the original was never written in the English we speak today. The first complete English translation of both Homeric epics was finished by the poet George Chapman and published in 1616. The particular text behind this video was translated by the 19th century writer Samuel Butler, who rendered the poem into flowing English prose, specifically for readers who could not read the original Greek. Here is one more detail worth knowing. For a long time, people assumed the poem's division into 24 books deliberately matched the 24 letters of the Greek alphabet. Today, most scholars consider that explanation to have no real historical basis, and believe the division was more likely introduced later, during a period of editorial organization. Another trace of the poem's oral roots survives in its very language. Recurring fixed phrases, like the wine-dark sea or rosy-fingered dawn, originally served as tools that made memorization and improvisation easier for oral performers. Yet over time, they became part of the poem's own unmistakable music. We have covered the Odyssey. This story is, in many ways, a continuation of the Iliad, which we have already covered on this channel, so you can find that book here as well. If you would like to listen to the complete book as an audiobook, you will find the link in the description. Subscribe for more books in this series. Until the next one, remember Odysseus, and never give up on finding your way home.